I want to begin tonight with a question that Western media is not asking, not because the answer is unavailable, but because the answer is inconvenient. When the United States Navy sank 3 Iranian vessels in the Strait of Hormuz 14 days ago, when American destroyers fired on ships that Washington described as threatening and Tehran described as conducting a routine patrol in sovereign waters, every major Western outlet ran the story the same way. A defensive action, a proportionate response, a measured application of force by a superpower with rules of engagement and legal authorities, and the restraint that distinguishes a professional military from an irregular force. Nobody asked what Iran would do next. I asked in an interview that ran on 3 platforms and was clipped, decontextualized, and used to describe me as an apologist. I said clearly and on record that Iran does not absorb the loss of its vessels and its sailors without response, that the Islamic Republic has never operated on the timeline that Washington assumes, that patience in Iranian strategic culture is not weakness, it is preparation. Last night, that preparation concluded. 300 Kheibar Shekan ballistic missiles launched from mobile platforms dispersed across 4 provinces in southern Iran, targeted with a precision that the architects of American carrier defense doctrine spent decades insisting was beyond Iranian reach. 6 United States Navy vessels, 2 Arleigh Burke class destroyers, 1 Ticonderoga class cruiser, and 3 guided missile frigates struck in a coordinated salvo that lasted from first impact to last 8 minutes and 17 seconds. The ships that sank Iranian vessels 14 days ago are this morning at the bottom of the Gulf of Oman. What you are about to hear is not the version that the Pentagon wants circulating. It is not the version that will appear in the press briefing scheduled for this afternoon, in which officials with carefully neutral expressions will use words like incident and exchange and ongoing assessment to describe what was, by any honest military metric, a decisive Iranian retaliatory strike against American naval assets. It is the version that the facts demand, and tonight I intend to give it to you in full. 3 questions will anchor what follows. First, how did Iran execute a 300-missile coordinated retaliatory strike against 6 American naval vessels simultaneously in open water, against a combined Aegis defensive envelope that American naval doctrine designated as the most capable ship defense architecture ever deployed, and achieved the result it achieved? Second, what does this retaliatory strike tell us about the Iranian doctrine of measured, proportionate, delayed response, and why Western strategic analysts consistently fail to model that doctrine accurately despite 45 years of consistent evidence about how it operates? Third, with 6 American vessels sunk in retaliation for 3 Iranian vessels, with the exchange ratio now on the record, and with Washington confronting a response calculus that has no clean options, where does this escalation ladder lead, and who controls the next rung? If this channel has been providing the analysis that takes Iranian strategic capability seriously, that does not dress Iranian military performance in the condescending language of surprise and shock, that reveals more about Western assumptions than about Iranian reality, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this with everyone in your network who wants to understand what is actually happening rather than what they are being told is happening. Leave your assessment in the comments. I read everyone. I want to know what you think Washington does next because I genuinely believe that question does not currently have a settled answer inside the Beltway. Now let us go inside last night. To understand what Iran executed last night, you first need to understand what Iran was responding to. Because the Western framing of this exchange, which begins the clock at last night's missile strike and treats the preceding 14 days as settled, justified history, is itself a form of strategic dishonesty that has consequences for how accurately anyone can assess what is actually happening. 14 days ago, the USS Gravely and the USS Nitsa, 2 Arleigh Burke class guided missile destroyers operating under Fifth Fleet authority in the Strait of Hormuz, fired on 3 Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy vessels. The American account describes those vessels as having made aggressive maneuvers toward American ships in international waters. The Iranian account describes a routine patrol in waters that Iran considers its sovereign operational space fired upon without warning or prior de-escalation contact. The factual dispute between those two accounts matters less for tonight's analysis than what both accounts agree on. 3 Iranian vessels were sunk, 34 Iranian sailors were killed, and the Islamic Republic of Iran, whose government issued a statement within hours of the incident promising a response at a time and place of its choosing, began that response 14 days later at 24:07 hours local time, and I want to dwell on that 14-day interval for a moment, because it is where the Western analytical failure is most visible and most consequential. The standard assessment in Washington in the days following the Hormuz incident was that Iran would respond in the manner it has typically responded to localized confrontations through proxy action, through rhetorical escalation, through a calibrated demonstration of displeasure that stops well short of direct military engagement with American assets. This assessment was based on a model of Iranian behavior that treats Iranian restraint as a permanent feature rather than as a condition with limits. It is a model that has been wrong before. It was wrong last night. Iranian strategic doctrine developed across 4 decades of confrontation with adversaries who possess conventional military superiority is built around a principle that Western analysts consistently underweight. The principle that response legitimacy requires proportionality, and that proportionality is calibrated not by the clock but by the balance sheet. 3 Iranian vessels sunk, 34 Iranian sailors killed. The Iranian military's internal calculus for proportionate response was not satisfied by rhetoric. It was satisfied last night when 6 American vessels were struck and the balance sheet moved. The operation itself, designated in Iranian military communications as Operation Answer Debt, a name whose translation into English carries a deliberate moral weight, was planned not in the 14 days following the Hormuz incident, but across a much longer preparatory window. Iranian military planners maintain what they describe as a contingency response library, pre-planned operational packages for retaliatory scenarios against American naval assets across multiple Persian Gulf and Gulf of Oman positions. Last night's operation was not designed in 14 days. It was selected from that library, updated with current target positioning data, and executed. The distinction matters. It means that the operational sophistication of last night's strike, the coordination, the timing, the target selection, the sequencing, was not improvised under time pressure. It was the product of long-term institutional preparation, and it means that similar packages exist, updated and ready for scenarios that have not yet occurred. At 0247 hours, Iranian electronic warfare assets positioned along the Makran coast activated jamming protocols targeting the Spy 1D radar arrays aboard the American vessels operating in the target sector. The jamming approach was consistent with the architecture Iranian electronic warfare doctrine has refined across multiple exercises and based on last night's results has now validated in live operational conditions. Not a full radar denial which would have triggered immediate escalation alerts and potentially given American vessels time to increase speed and alter their defensive posture. A targeted degradation of the frequency bands used for ballistic missile terminal phase tracking discrimination. Enough degradation to reduce pre-engagement intercept probability without producing the visible signature of a full jamming assault. At 0258 hours, Iranian signals intelligence assets confirmed that American radar emissions indicated no awareness of imminent threat. The electronic deception was holding. At 0303 hours, 300 Kheibar Shekan ballistic missiles left their mobile launch platforms across 4 provinces. The targeting allocation was precise in a way that communicates intent as clearly as capability. The 2 Arleigh Burke destroyers that fired on the Iranian vessels 14 days ago, the Gravely and the Nitsa, were the primary targets, receiving a combined allocation of 90 missiles across 3 sequenced waves. The Ticonderoga cruiser, operating as the strike group's air defense coordinator, received 60 missiles. The 3 guided missile frigates, providing the outer screen, received 50 missiles each. Iranian targeting doctrine in this operation was communicating something beyond military capability. It was communicating institutional memory. The specific vessels that sank Iranian ships were specifically targeted. The message embedded in that targeting selection, "You struck our ships and specifically your ships will pay," is the kind of message that Iranian strategic communication has always preferred to deliver through action rather than statement. The engagement lasted 8 minutes and 17 seconds, from first impact to the confirmed sinking of the sixth vessel. Of the 300 Kheibar Shekan missiles launched, American Aegis systems across the target vessels managed to intercept 81, a figure that under normal non-degraded radar conditions would represent a significant defensive failure, and under the jamming degraded conditions of last night represents a performance broadly consistent with Iranian operational modeling. The remaining 219 missiles reached terminal phase. Phalanx close-in weapon systems aboard the surviving escort vessels engaged in the final seconds and achieved kills against a fraction of the terminal threats. The mathematics of simultaneous saturation across 6 separate vessel positions with degraded radar and depleted SM-6 inventories did not produce outcomes that American defensive doctrine had prepared its operators to manage. By 0311 hours, all 6 American vessels were either sunk or in the process of sinking. The Iranian strike was over before the first American emergency communication reached Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. There is a conversation I have been having with Western interlocutors for years in television studios, in academic conferences, in the kind of off-the-record conversations that journalists conduct when they want information they will not attribute. The conversation follows a consistent pattern. I describe Iranian military capability, my interlocutor acknowledges it in general terms, and then introduces a qualifier, usually some variation of "but surely Iran understands that using that capability against American assets would trigger a response that Iran cannot survive." Last night, Iran used that capability against American assets, and the response from Washington as of this morning is a press briefing that lasted 6 minutes and answered no questions of substance. I'm not saying this to be provocative. I am saying it because the gap between what Western analysts have spent years predicting Iran would never dare to do and what Iran has now done is itself analytically significant. It tells us something about the quality of the strategic modeling that produced those predictions. And it tells us something about what Iran has concluded regarding the actual as distinct from the theoretical cost of direct military retaliation against American naval assets. The Kheibar Shekan is the weapon system that made last night's operation possible, and its performance in actual combat conditions against the most capable ship defense architecture currently deployed at sea deserves honest examination. The missile entered Iranian operational inventory following its public unveiling in 2022. Western analysts at the time described it as a significant development while simultaneously expressing the standard qualifier that Iranian missile capability, however impressive on paper, had not been tested against serious air defenses in live operational conditions. It has now been tested 3 times in the past 8 months in the strike against the Gerald R. Ford that this channel covered previously, in the Hormuz engagement 6 weeks ago and last night. The operational record across those 3 engagements is consistent in ways that should concern every naval planner whose defensive architecture was designed around the assumption that Iranian missiles would underperform their specifications under real combat conditions. They have not underperformed. They have performed precisely as their specifications indicated they would. The solid fuel propulsion system means launch preparation time is measured in minutes rather than hours, eliminating the observable fueling signatures that American surveillance satellites are tasked to detect. The inertial navigation system, updated by terminal optical seeking, means the guidance is independent of GPS and immune to the jamming operations that American electronic warfare assets have been running continuously across the Persian Gulf theater. The penetrating warhead configuration means that impacts against hardened naval targets produce secondary fires and explosions in fuel and ordnance spaces that amplify the primary damage well beyond what the initial impact alone would cause. None of these characteristics were secrets. They were documented in Iranian military statements, in open-source technical analysis, in the kind of careful reading of available evidence that serious intelligence analysis is supposed to conduct. The question worth asking, and that Western governments are not publicly asking, though I am certain they are asking it privately, is why the defensive architecture of 6 American naval vessels with full knowledge of the Kheibar Shekan's documented capabilities proved insufficient to defeat a 300 missile salvo. The answer, I think, has two components. The first is technical. The Aegis combat system is a formidable defensive platform against the threat environments it was designed for. It was not designed for simultaneous saturation attacks against multiple vessels in coordinated waves under electronic warfare degradation conditions. The engagement mathematics interceptor inventory divided by simultaneous inbound tracks across 6 vessel positions under degraded radar resolution across a compressed temporal window do not produce favorable defensive outcomes. This is not a failure of Aegis system performance. It is a failure of the threat modeling that determined what Aegis systems needed to be capable of defending against. The second component is institutional. American naval doctrine has been built around a carrier-centric model in which the carrier is the primary asset and the surrounding strike group exists to protect it. The destroyers and cruisers that were sunk last night were not designed as primary combat targets. They were designed as defensive screens, optimizing a defensive screen against an adversary willing to target the screen directly. With sufficient missile volume to saturate its engagement capacity requires a different set of assumptions than American naval planners were operating with when the current generation of surface combatants was designed and deployed. Iran understood both of those components, and it designed last night's operation to exploit both of them simultaneously. The National Security Council emergency session that convened within 2 hours of the first confirmed sinking reports ran for 9 hours. I want to be precise about what I know and what I am inferring because intellectual honesty about the boundary between confirmed information and analytical inference is something I consider non-negotiable. What is confirmed? The session occurred. It ran for an extended period, and what emerged from it was not a military decision but a statement carefully worded, appropriately grave, committing to accountability without specifying what accountability means operationally. What I am inferring from that pattern, from 9 hours of deliberation producing a statement rather than a decision, is consistent with what any serious analyst would expect given the option set available to Washington this morning. The retaliatory instinct is always present. It was present after the Gerald R. Ford strike. It was present in every previous Iranian military action against American assets. The vocabulary of overwhelming response, of unacceptable consequences, of demonstrating that America does not absorb attacks without reply, that vocabulary is institutional. It does not require deliberation to produce. What requires deliberation is the confrontation with the questions underneath it. The first question is targeting Iran's Kheibar Shekan force is not concentrated at identifiable fixed facilities that a finite American strike package can efficiently destroy. It is dispersed across mobile launcher networks, underground hardened facilities, and mountain tunnel complexes whose current precise positions are either unknown or insufficiently confirmed for targeting authorization. Striking known Iranian military infrastructure bases, radar installations, command facilities would cause damage and casualties without meaningfully degrading Iran's capacity to conduct follow-on missile operations. The Iranian military has specifically designed its force structure to survive the retaliatory strike that follows any major operation. They have had 45 years to think about this problem, and they have thought about it carefully. The second question is escalation. An American retaliatory strike against Iranian territory is not a discrete military event. It is the opening move in an escalatory sequence whose subsequent moves Iran controls more than Washington does. Iran's capacity for follow-on action, additional missile strikes, Strait of Hormuz closure operations, activation of regional partner networks, strikes against American bases across the Gulf region, does not diminish following an American retaliatory strike. It activates Washington is not calculating whether to retaliate. It is calculating whether the retaliation it can execute produces outcomes better than the current situation. And that calculation is genuinely difficult when the adversary's response capacity exceeds what American regional military presence can reliably absorb. The third question is political. 6 American naval vessels have been sunk. The American public, which has not been prepared by its government or its media for the reality of what Iranian military capability can now accomplish, is experiencing a shock for which no official narrative has yet been constructed. The administration faces simultaneous pressure from the political right, demanding overwhelming military response regardless of strategic consequence, and from a more cautious center that understands without fully articulating that overwhelming military response against an adversary of Iran's current capability is not the straightforward exercise that the vocabulary of overwhelming response implies. Into that political pressure environment, the NSC is attempting to produce a decision that satisfies domestic audiences, maintains alliance cohesion, avoids triggering the escalatory sequence described above, and advances American strategic interests in a region where American strategic interests have just suffered their most significant single engagement setback in decades. That is not a solvable problem on a 9-hour timeline. It may not be a solvable problem at all in the form Washington has been attempting to solve it. What the Gulf Arab states are doing this morning is instructive about how America's regional partners are reading the situation. Saudi Arabia has issued a statement calling for de escalation and dialogue. The UAE has contacted Iranian diplomatic channels directly. Bahrain, the Fifth Fleet's home port, whose hosting of American naval forces has been the physical anchor of American Gulf presence for 3 decades, has communicated through back channels that it is reviewing the terms of its basing agreement. States that host a military guarantor that has just lost 6 vessels in a single engagement without producing a coherent response recalibrate quickly, not because they want to, it because they have no choice. I want to say something that I think is essential to understanding not just last night, but the entire trajectory of Iranian-American confrontation across the past 4 decades, and that Western commentary, for structural reasons, consistently fails to articulate. Iran does not forget that statement sounds simple. Its strategic implications are not simple at all. The Western model of Iranian behavior, the model that predicted Iran would not respond directly to the Hormuz incident, that predicted the 14-day interval would reduce rhetorical escalation rather than military decision-making, that as an isolated event evaluated on its own costs and benefits. Under that model, the cost of directly striking American naval assets is always too high relative to the benefit of any specific retaliatory objective. Therefore, Iran will not do it. That model misses something fundamental about how Iranian strategic culture actually works. Iran does not evaluate retaliatory options as isolated cost-benefit calculations. It evaluates them as installments in a long-term account whose balance must ultimately be settled. The Hormuz incident, 3 Iranian vessels sunk, 34 sailors killed, was entered into that account 14 days ago. Last night's operation was the settlement. 6 American vessels for 3 Iranian vessels, a ratio that Iranian military planners considered proportionate, communicated through the specific targeting of the specific ships responsible, and executed at a time of their choosing rather than Washington's. This doctrine, which I would describe as answered debt, borrowing the name Iran itself gave to last night's operation, has been visible in Iranian strategic behavior since the 1980s. It operates on timelines that Western political cycles do not accommodate. American administrations change every 4 or 8 years. Iranian strategic memory does not change with administrations. The account that was opened when the United States shot down Iran Air Flight 655 in 1988, killing 290 civilians, has never been formally closed. The account opened when American sanctions killed Iranian children who could not access medicine has never been formally closed. These accounts accumulate. They are paid in installments at times and through instruments that Iranian planners select rather than American planners anticipate. What this means for the current situation is something that I genuinely do not think Washington has fully processed. The Hormuz incident account has been settled, but the broader account, the 45-year account of sanctions, assassinations, sabotage, proxy warfare, and the sustained attempt to strangle a civilization into submission, has not been settled. Last night's operation was not the final entry in that ledger. It was the most recent one. I raise this not to threaten or to predict specific future actions. I raise it because honest analysis requires acknowledging what Iranian strategic culture has consistently communicated about how it understands the relationship between grievance and response. Ignoring that communication, treating Iranian patience as permanent rather than as preparation, is the analytical failure that produced the surprise of last night. And repeating that failure in assessing what comes next would be a consequential error. Pull back from the operational details. Look at what last night means for the architecture of regional and global power, because the consequences of a successful Iranian retaliatory strike against 6 American naval vessels extend well beyond the Persian Gulf. The foundational premise of American deterrence in the Middle East has been a specific threat that military action against American assets will produce a retaliatory response so overwhelming and so costly that no rational adversary would accept the exchange. This premise has functioned as a psychological anchor for American regional strategy, not because it has been continuously tested and validated, but because it has been continuously assumed and asserted. Last night tested it. Iran struck 6 American vessels in retaliation for 3 Iranian vessels. So the American response 9 hours into deliberation is a statement. The exchange ratio Iran achieved 2 American vessels for every 1 Iranian vessel is now on the record as a demonstrated operational outcome rather than a theoretical possibility. And the American deterrent threat, the promise of overwhelming response, has not been executed. Every government in the region is reading that gap. The distance between the threat and the execution, the 9 hours of deliberation that produced a statement, the absence of the carrier aviation that would normally be the opening instrument of American retaliatory action, absent because the carriers are not in the theater in the force concentration that deterrence doctrine requires, following the earlier engagements that this channel has covered. Saudi Arabia is reading it. The UAE is reading it. Turkey is reading it. Every Gulf monarchy that has structured its security around the credibility of American deterrence is this morning conducting its own assessment of what that credibility is actually worth, not as a theoretical proposition, but as an operational reality revealed by last night's evidence. Russia is observing with the strategic satisfaction of a power that has been arguing for years that American hegemony is less durable than its proponents claim. Every American strategic resource consumed by the Persian Gulf crisis is unavailable for the European theater, for the Ukraine conflict, for the Baltic deterrence posture that NATO's eastern members have been requesting with increasing urgency. China's observation is, as always, more forward-looking and more consequential. The question Beijing has been asking with great care and great patience is whether American military commitment to Taiwan is credible under conditions of real military pressure rather than theoretical deterrence. Last night provided data relevant to that question, not a definitive answer. Data, and in Chinese strategic culture, data is accumulated methodically before conclusions are drawn and acted upon. The Global South, the governments that have been told insistently and with great confidence that American military supremacy is a permanent feature of the international landscape against which all strategic planning must be conducted, is processing last night with a combination of shock and something that I think is honestly described as a revision of prior assumptions, not celebration, revision. The assumption that American deterrence is absolute is no longer available as an operating premise for governments that have been basing their strategic calculations on it. What replaces that assumption will be constructed over time. The construction has begun. 300 Kheibar Shekan ballistic missiles, 6 American naval vessels, and 8 minutes and 17 seconds. The ships that sank Iranian vessels 14 days ago are this morning at the bottom of the Gulf of Oman. The Pentagon has issued a statement. The Gulf monarchies are making calls to Tehran. The world's strategic assumptions are being revised in real time. This is not the outcome that Washington modeled. It is the outcome that Iranian strategic patience, Iranian military capability, and Iranian institutional memory produced. The question I leave you with tonight is one I think deserves genuine reflection rather than a reflexive answer. If the doctrine of answered debt is as the